Welcome once again to our reading of Why the Cross. In this episode, we will be looking at the testimonies and the prophecies. And it begins. An even greater reason for seeing the crucifixion of Jesus as an appalling travesty of justice is the Bible's insistence that he was not merely a man of outstanding moral integrity, but that he was blameless in all he ever thought, said, or did. We get hints of this in remarkable testimonies given just before his death. Pontius Pilate told the chief priests and crowds, "I find no guilt in this man," Luke 23:4. During the second trial, Pilate's wife urged him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man," Matthew 27:19. When one of the criminals crucified at the same time called on Jesus to rescue them all, his partner in crime replied, "Don't you fear God, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Luke 23:40-41. As Jesus drew his final breath, the centurion in charge of the execution squad declared, "Surely this was a righteous man." Luke 23:47. These may be impressions gained over the course of just a few hours, but they point us in the right direction. Judas Iscariot's confession that he had sinned by betraying innocent blood, Matthew 27:4, is much more impressive, as he had spent 3 years in Jesus' company and had every opportunity to see and hear him at close hand. This convinced him not only that Jesus should not be sentenced to death, but that he had no moral flaws. Peter, a local fisherman and one of Jesus' first 12 disciples, had also spent over 3 years in Jesus' company and testified that his life had been without blemish, 1 Peter 1:19. As someone who at times had spoken rashly and deceitfully, he was well qualified to contrast his own behavior with that of Jesus, who committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth, 1 Peter 2:22. John, a disciple who had a particularly close relationship with Jesus, had no hesitation in calling him righteous, 1 John 2:29. This is the same word used by the Roman centurion at the cross, yet from John it carries much more weight. Another New Testament writer says that Jesus was holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, Hebrews 7:26, and that although in every respect tempted as are we, he was without sin, Hebrews 4:15. The Apostle Paul had once been on a personal crusade to destroy the Christian church and wipe out all Jesus' followers. Yet the thinking of this brilliant, highly educated man was transformed. He had once considered Jesus a blasphemous deceiver whose teaching threatened the religious life of the entire nation, yet became convinced that Jesus knew no sin, 2 Corinthians 5:21. Paul was later to be flogged, tortured, imprisoned, stoned, and exposed to death again and again, 2 Corinthians 11:23, for his beliefs. Yet he never once flinched from his conviction that Jesus had no moral or spiritual flaws. Why the cross for someone whose words, actions, life, and lifestyle had convinced so many people that he was faultless? The prophecies. The Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, has 39 books written by over 20 authors, some anonymous, but it is not a random collection of unrelated material. Instead, it has one unifying theme: God's dealings with mankind at large, and with the Jewish nation in particular. Central to this was the promise that God would one day break into human history by sending a great deliverer to deal with humankind's greatest problem, its separation from God because of sin. This deliverer would eventually be known as the Messiah, which means anointed one. Old Testament prophets, priests, and kings were anointed with oil when they took office, symbolizing their authority to serve God, but none was called the Messiah. Many prophets wrote about the coming Messiah, and the last of them brought this assurance from God: "The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come. Malachi 3:1. There were no further messianic prophecies for 400 years. Then Jesus came on the scene. Worshipping in his local synagogue in Nazareth when he was about 30 years old, he was handed a scroll containing part of the Old Testament and stood to read these words. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Luke 4:18-19. Those present would have heard these words many times, as they were part of a well-known passage written by the prophet Isaiah and promising the coming of the Messiah. But what happened next was electrifying. With the eyes of all in the synagogue fixed on him, Jesus declared, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Luke 4:20-21. The impact was stunning. Here was the son of a local tradesman claiming that Isaiah's prophecy was about him. The listener's first impression was favorable, but as he developed the implications of his claim, they quickly turned against him, and he narrowly escaped being thrown over a nearby cliff. Over the next 3 years, Jesus continued to underline his amazing claim, regardless of any opposition. In doing so, he quoted from 24 Old Testament books, drawing on all 3 major sections of the Old Testament, the Law of Moses and the Prophets, and the Psalms. To give one remarkable example, Daniel prophesied in the Old Testament that the coming Messiah would be one like a son of man, Daniel 7:13. And Jesus applied the title Son of Man to himself nearly 80 times. Skeptics may argue that this proves nothing, as history is littered with stories of people making outrageous or bizarre claims. A school student with a reputation for embarrassing guest speakers once challenged me by saying that when Jesus discovered he had been born in Bethlehem and in a family descended from Israel's king of David, both of which had been prophesied in the Old Testament, he simply made sure that he fulfilled the other messianic prophecies. In reply, I pointed out that he would have needed to fulfill about 300 in all, and that arranging to be born of a virgin, prophesied in the Old Testament and recorded in the New Testament, would have presented more than a little difficulty. The skeptic never said another word. Even if we begin with the Old Testament patriarch Abraham, who lived about 2,000 years before Jesus was born, we would see that the Messiah's family tree followed God's precisely drawn line. God promised Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed," Genesis 12:3, which meant that the Messiah would come from Abraham's family. The line can then be traced through Abraham's son Isaac, not his other son Ishmael, then Isaac's son Jacob, not his other son Esau, then Jacob's 4th son Judah, bypassing the other 11. The same remarkable process went on for hundreds of years, always within Abraham's family line, until it reached Israel's King David. The opening verse of Matthew's Gospel calls Jesus the son of David, the son of Abraham, Matthew 1:1. But as he was not born until about 30 generations after David, the word son obviously means descendant. What Matthew makes clear is that Jesus ticked all the right boxes as far as the messianic line of descent was concerned. Even his place of birth was pinpointed precisely. God had promised, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel." Micah 5:2. There were 2 Bethlehems, one in the region of Ephrathah in Judea, and the other in Zebulun, 70 miles to the north. The prophecy made it clear that the first of these would be the birthplace of the Messiah, and the New Testament tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Matthew 2:1. From then on, Jesus' life fulfilled hundreds of prophecies about the Messiah, covering his family's social status, his lifestyle, his character, and his amazing powers. His miracles of healing alone fulfilled a messianic prophecy made over 700 years earlier. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Isaiah 35, 5-6. The picture becomes even clearer when we discover that nearly 30 Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah were fulfilled by Jesus in the 24 hours leading up to his death. Here are 10 with the New Testament record of their fulfillment. 1. One of the psalmists has the Messiah saying, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." Psalm 41:9. Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' inner circle of disciples, betrayed him to the religious authorities. 2. The same psalmist prophesies, "Malicious witnesses rise up." Psalm 35:11. At Jesus' trial before Caiaphas, many false witnesses came forward. Matthew 26:60. 3. Isaiah movingly records the Messiah saying, "I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting." Isaiah 56. Matthew records that when the soldiers were humiliating the blindfolded Jesus, they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Matthew 26, 67 and 68. 4. Isaiah writes, "He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth." Isaiah 53:7. Pilate tried to browbeat Jesus into convicting himself, but he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Matthew 27:14. 5. Isaiah also prophesies of the Messiah that he was to be numbered with the transgressors. Isaiah 53:12. Matthew records of Jesus that 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. Matthew 27:38. 6. In one of his psalms, David has the Messiah crying, "All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." Psalm 22, 7-8. Matthew records the Jewish religious leaders mocking Jesus as he hung on the cross and crying, "Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him." Matthew 27, 42-43. In another psalm, David prophesies, "He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken." Psalm 34:20. After the 3 men had been crucified, soldiers came to ensure that they were dead by breaking their legs. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. It's John 19:33. 8. Zechariah sees the Messiah crying, "They look on me, on him whom they have pierced." Zechariah 12:10. John tells us that to make sure Jesus was dead, a soldier pierced his side with a spear. John 19:34. 9. Jeremiah prophesies about the actions involving elders, priests, the blood of the innocent, a potter's field, and a burial place. See Jeremiah 19:1-15. And Zechariah prophesies about someone being valued at 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 11:13. Matthew records that after Judas Iscariot realized his appalling sin in betraying Jesus, he threw the money into the temple, but that the priests and elders, calling it blood money, took it and used it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Matthew 27, 6 and 7. 10. David writes, "They divide my garments among them, for my clothing they cast lots." Psalm 22:18. Matthew records that after they had crucified Jesus, the Roman soldiers divided his garments among them by casting lots. Matthew 27:35. Surely this evidence is a powerful pointer to his identity. It is hardly surprising that in the New Testament, Jesus is identified as Christ, the Greek translation of the Old Testament Messiah, about 600 times. Suggestions that Jesus fixed things to bolster his claim generate more heat than light, and for the British author and broadcaster Sir Ludovic Kennedy to dismiss all the messianic prophecies as bogus says more about him than it does about them. Why the cross for the one person in all history whose birth, life, and death pointed his being God's promised Messiah?